You can't spell accommodate without commode, and it's time to ditch these accommodations on another NES Works recap.
Now who is the fool? No, not Wizard's Bane.
Last time, I highlighted the best 10 NES releases from the system's first 2 years of life. With that ranking, I tried to walk a line between celebrating games that remain fun to play now and those that made a big impact at the time. That's something I can speak to myself because I am an old man who was pretty fixated on the NES right out of the gate. I was there. I saw its glory for myself. This week, I want to talk about the inverse of that last episode, the worst games of 1985 through 87. But again, I'd like to approach this a little differently from the usual worst of rankings that you see online. Listen, there's no value in just bagging on bad games. The angry video game nerd started almost 20 years ago, man. If all you have to bring to the table is just a 5th generation VHS dub of James Rolfe jokes, you might as well just stay in bed. No, bad video games usually turn out to have been bad for many different reasons. And many of those games could just as easily have turned out to be good, with some small adjustments. And that's what I'd like to focus on here. Why these games turned out to be lousy, and what, if any, redeeming features they offer despite that. But they are indeed bad. Bad enough that NES fans didn't even like them at the time, when the bar for quality was low, and we were just stupid children who didn't know any better. As with the best of ranking, I'd like to begin this list with a game that didn't quite make the cut, even though in this case, I personally hate it and have been using it as a punching bag for nearly 20 years. Which is appropriate, given the theme of our dishonorable mention entry for this episode, Urban Champion. The fighting genre didn't really solidify until 1991 in Street Fighter II, but people created lots of fighting games before that. Urban Champion predates the original Street Fighter by several years. By the time it hit Famicom in late 1984, there were far richer early takes for players to choose from in arcades, on Famicom, and on computers. Karate Champ, Ye Are Kung Fu, and of course the fighter for grown-ups, Karateka. By that measure, Urban Champion is pretty rough. It barely qualifies as a fighting game with a theme of street brawling and the complexity, or lack thereof, to match. The controls and mechanics are about as basic as it gets. Nintendo appears to have taken the combat design for this game from the boxing Game & Watch system, or at least they developed the two in tandem, as they play a lot alike. I mean, that's your problem right there, an NES game that could just as easily have been an LCD handheld. I think Nintendo's developers, specifically Makoto Kano, who previously had designed Wild Gunman and would go on to design Metroid, intuited the underwhelming nature of this game and tried to zhuzh it up with a lot of window dressing. Instead of being a straightforward brawl, it's a legit street fight in which you attempt to hammer your opponent backward until he plunges comically into a manhole. Meanwhile, police cars cruise by from time to time, causing you to break up the fight and feign indifference until they drive past, and annoyed citizens drop flower pots on your head, as an in-kind complaint about the noise. It's not a good fighting game, but it does have a personality and it does support two players. With a little more depth to the fighting, a la Karateka or Kung Fu, Urban Champion could have been okay, but it isn't, and that means it almost deserves to be on this list. We all know why Donkey Kong Jr. math exists. Nintendo needed to bolster its first-year Famicom lineup back in the days when the company produced pretty much all of its own software internally. So they recycled assets from another game to create a math tutor. And you know, edutainment games aren't necessarily bad. Think of Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, or Oregon Trail, or Reader Rabbit. Donkey Kong Jr. does not belong to those vaunted ranks. It's not the kind of game that kids would try to sneak in some playtime for on the classroom computer when the teacher was out of the room. It's the kind of game that children avoid, and that's rough because Donkey Kong Jr. math is largely useless unless you can lure another person to play with you. Unlike Urban Champion, Donkey Kong Jr. math doesn't treat multiplayer as an option, but rather as a compulsory consideration. There's no AI controlling the miscolored second junior here, so the fundamental concept behind the game, a race to create sums, goes nowhere solo. In principle, the concept of using Donkey Kong Jr. as the basis for a math competition is kinda neat. In practice, it's pretty useless and betrays the bare-bones nature of Nintendo's early game development environment. This is the kind of game you get from a small team of people rushing to churn out as much software as possible in practically zero time. It wasn't until the advent of Nintendo Switch Online and its competitive connectivity that Donkey Kong Jr. Math began to realize some of its potential, which is neat, but I do think that when it takes 40 years for a game to come into its own, it speaks to some sort of underlying flaw. I'm not going to lie, this list is going to include a lot of Micronix developed games. And we begin here, appropriately enough, with the first Micronix developed game to reach the NES, Capcom's 1942. Micronix was weird. Their games tended to suffer from what appears to be the worst programming to appear on NES, with sputtering animation, tons of flicker and slowdown, and jumpy sprite movement that skips a frame or three in action. Yet some of their games demonstrated genuine creative ambition. It's not that Micronix didn't care. Look at all the stuff they added to Victory Road, or even the charming maze action of Onyanko Town. And it suggests the work of people who genuinely liked video games and wanted to do cool things with them. They just couldn't. Those technical shortcomings really dogged their work in 1942, a crisp and challenging shooter in arcades that paired a World War II theme with some interesting play mechanics, like assistant mini-planes to boost your firepower. Micronix captured everything that made 1942 stand out here. They just did a terrible job of it. The twitchy movement of the planes, to their abysmal eardrum-shattering attempts to translate the coin-op's military snare and whistle background music into NES audio. There's no question that the underlying game here is really good, but this is not a good interpretation of that material at all. Oh hey, Micronix again. This time they're creating a sequel to a console classic, or converting the computer version of a sequel to a console classic to NES, or something. I'm not entirely sure where this game came from. All I know is that Pitfall had a sequel called Pitfall 2, both created by the same man, David Crane. And then that sequel got remade for arcades in SG-1000 by Sega. And then a few years later, Activision made its return to console publishing with a third entry in the Pitfall series called Super Pitfall. David Crane, it should be noted, had nothing to do with Super Pitfall. No, this game comes to us from Micronix, and if the box didn't say Pitfall on it, you'd be hard-pressed to identify this as a Pitfall game. It has some big ambitions, to be sure. Pitfall Harry starts by exploring a bunch of caverns, and he can wield a handgun, and he seeks treasures and secrets. But somehow you're supposed to figure out that you should perform some counterintuitive actions, which reveal paths to the underworld, where Pitfall Harry explores hell. I guess there's some swinging on vines here to tie it back to the original Pitfall, but man, that's about all you've got. It's a strange little game that has very little to do with the work whose name it bears. And it's also horribly designed. It controls poorly. It practically can't be completed without use of guides. And it runs with all the grace you'd expect from Micronix, which is to say, none. With more refined programming, less obtuse design, and improved controls, Super Pitfall could have been a fondly remembered NES classic, but instead it's Super Pitfall. Sometimes the best of intentions run aground, like a massive boat smashing into a crowded pier and killing everyone. That's Deadly Towers, the Titanic of NES cartridges. A bold attempt to go bigger and better than anyone ever had before, and which resulted in a figurative mass casualty event. A lot of bad games turn out that way because the people behind them seemed indifferent to the end results, just wanted to cash a paycheck. Whatever sins Deadly Towers may have committed, that is not one of them. Its problem comes from the opposite direction. The designer clearly wanted to make a massive, complex, intricate role-playing adventure, bringing the depth and mystery of Falcom's Dragon Slayer games to NES. At times, it almost works out. If you can reach the towers where you need to set fire to Hell's 7 bells, the underlying premise of the adventure starts to come into focus. Unfortunately, most people never make it that far because the road between the beginning and the towers is nearly impossible for any one human to endure. Most of your time in Deadly Towers is spent in the game's massive labyrinths, where you need to collect a few key items in order to complete the game. The problem is that the labyrinths span something like 8,000 screens in total. They're repetitive, consisting of the same rooms over and over again, and your best hope for navigating them is to map them based on the monsters that dwell in each room. But even finding them is difficult. Their entrances are invisible, and you only seem to stumble into them at the worst possible times. And if you die in one before escaping, you lose all the goodies that you earned inside. And you will die, because your protagonist is weak, his attacks have terrible range and hitboxes. Enemies attack aggressively and can sap all of your health in an instant, and basically the game hates you. Like Super Pitfall, Deadly Towers might have been a classic if it had come along a few years later to take advantage of bigger ROM chips, memory management systems, and the good game design practices that developers locked into over the course of the NES era. But the whole thing about Deadly Towers is that it was an early NES game, one of the works that had to flail about clumsily and fail so that others could avoid making those same mistakes. In a lot of ways, I admire Deadly Towers, and I think it's an important milestone for the NES. Dear God, that does not keep it from being pretty awful, or make it a game that I ever want to play again. The NES port of Ring King has become infamous because of the animation that appears between rounds, which makes it appear as though your trainer is performing oral sex on a boxer. Because the actual experience of playing Ring King just isn't that interesting. Most boxing games back then weren't. Heck, some of them even used menu-based inputs to give the pugilist commands. At least Ring King doesn't do that. But it didn't do a lot of other things too. It didn't give players more than a single character sprite design. So every boxer is a palette-swapped version of the same guy, with the 70s mustache and perm. It didn't give them much in the way of play options either, with a sad handful of punches at your command. You can move freely around the ring in a sort of renegade-style three-quarters perspective, sure, and that's fine, but pro wrestling had already presented ring-based combat with a similar viewpoint, while also demonstrating the importance of distinct individual characters and varied moves. And it had the poor fortune to arrive in stores around the same time as Rocky for Master System, a limited game that at least looked amazing, and Punch-Out, a game that looked awesome and played so well that people still go back to it today. So you can hardly blame people for giggling about those interstitial animations, if only because of envy that your boxer is having a much more enjoyable time with Ring King than you are. Vertical shooters ruled Japan's arcade scene in the early 1980s, for reasons that I'm sure we'll never understand. And so a lot of those games made their way to Famicom, some of which made their way to NES through localization. Alpha Mission might just be the least interesting of them all. On its surface, Alpha Mission is basically just a mediocre Star Force clone. And there's nothing more to say about it, really, because there's nothing to Alpha Mission beneath its surface. It's one of those generic shooters where you fly around as waves of ill-defined enemies swarm in ill-defined patterns. You shoot, they shoot, things blow up, you beat a boss, and the scenery and action never change outside of some palette swaps. SNK did make some vague gestures toward variety by giving you a power-up system where you can collect icons emblazoned with different letters to gain bonuses and alternate weapons. They thought highly enough of this element to name the game after it. Those icons would continue to resurface in SNK's land-based shooters like Ikari Warriors and Iron Tank, but honestly, they're nothing to be especially proud of. SNK was kind of weird like that. The one saving grace of Alpha Mission comes from the weapons select system, which takes place in an interactive menu where you fly over the weapon you want to activate before returning to action. It's kind of neat, I guess, but it doesn't make up for the fact that, as with so many Xevious-derived shooters of the 90s, it lacks variety and soul. It's just a long, repetitive slog of weaving between bullets, fully interchangeable with a dozen other boring vertical shooters like this, chasing after the dream of someone else's big bucks. I get the impulse to differentiate a game with a gimmick, but the letter icons make a poor substitute for, say, interesting level designs or meaningful enemy programming. Enjoy your bucket of digital slop, kids. In a way, Karate Kid, the video game, perfectly captures the spirit of the movie. In the film, Mr. Miyagi taught Daniel Russo the martial arts by subjecting him to a succession of tedious, demeaning, mundane chores. I don't know that Karate Kid the game will make you a proper martial artist, but it certainly feels tedious, demeaning, and mundane. Publisher LJN made a business out of locking down Hollywood hits to adapt into video games, and when they teamed up with Karate Kid developer Atlas, those games usually turned out to be weirdly good, if kind of messy. Sadly, Karate Kid uncharacteristically only manages the messy part. This is no Jaws or Friday the 13th, some secret work of genius lurking on just the wrong side of masterpiece. It plays like a clone of Kung Fu that replaces the precise, flexible combat mechanics with sloppy platforming and some gimmicks. For example, in addition to pure chop-socky action, you have to slug your way through a storm that pelts you with debris. And the final showdown with Chosun is made far more difficult by the fact that attacking too aggressively will knock the kidnapped lady you need to rescue into the water, killing her instantly and resulting in the loss of a life for you too. Atlas did throw in some mediocre minigames based on Daniel's training montages to break up the action. These don't redeem the rest of the game, but at least they look nice. The Karate Kid would have turned out better if Atlas had skipped their attempts to recreate beats of the movie and just focused on giving the primary game sequences a greater sense of control, variety, and accuracy. Ditching that pointless opening tournament sequence in favor of tighter controls or more diversity in enemy types, that would have been the real Karate Master move. When you watch a pro wrestling match, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Is it, this would be so much better if before every action, each wrestler paused and chose their next command from a menu? No, it's not, because you're not insane. The fools at Technos Japan and Data East, however, have no such attachment to reality, which is why they gave us Tag Team Wrestling. There were actually 2 awful wrestling games to appear in the first wave of third-party NES software in late 1986, but I don't want to bag on wrestling too much. I've got better things to do with my life than waste time thinking about pro wrestling. So Muscle Tag Team Match gets a pass, even though it's worse than most of the games on this list. But that's only because Tag Team Wrestling is so much more reprehensible as a piece of software. It looks terrible, it sounds awful, and it plays, well, calling this play as being a little kind. It lumbers through the universe, destroying all it touches by attempting to turn the act of wrestling against another burly man into a menu-driven experience. I mean, I kind of get it. Wrestling involves a lot of moves, both offensive and defensive, from grapples to throws. And 2 buttons isn't a lot for making all of those choices. Technos decided that the best way to give players access to a full array of options would be to dedicate a single button to bringing up a menu in the heat of action and selecting your next move. I guess it's not the worst idea in the world, since pro wrestling does involve a lot of pauses, so that the actors can sell their next move and hype the audience with anticipation. So you may as well turn those moments into menu selection times. But the actual execution of the concept, especially in this version, is just too much of a mess to work. In order to bring up a command menu, you have to gain initiative, which means hammering the attack button. Once you land a successful blow, the menu pops up and you have just a couple of seconds to scroll through commands and select your action. Laggy controls and poor collision detection make this process, shall we say, fraught, prone to error, hard to predict, difficult to even execute in the first place, and all in service of a bad wrestling game. I don't know how you could save pro wrestling except by completely reprogramming it top to bottom to make the menus more responsive, or just replace them with contextual actions like pretty much every subsequent wrestling game ever did, or just bury the cartridges in a New Mexico landfill. What was that I was saying earlier about monotonous SNK shooters? Because here's the king of them, and you will not be surprised that it too was developed for NES by Micronix. Ikari Warriors really had a lot working against it, huh? I'm sorry to say that it did not overcome these inherent setbacks at all. This conversion operated on a flawed premise to begin with, like every console port. The arcade machine made use of an innovative rotary stick that allowed players to move their character in one direction while aiming in another, essentially condensing the Robotron 2084 twin-stick shooter concept into a single, unified input device, which allowed the player's right hand to work the attack buttons and allowed the use of more than a single weapon, as would be expected in a commando clone. The NES could not do that. It had a 4-directional crosspad and 2 buttons. I suppose you could make a case for a dual controller input scheme like some developers botched together for home ports of Robotron, but that would have undermined Ikari Warriors' other key selling point: 2-person simultaneous play. If one kid uses both controllers at once in order to guide their character around the battlefield, that sort of rules out a second player participating at the same time, you know? The 4-score wouldn't ship until the end of 1989, which didn't offer much help to games released in the middle of 1987. Bad news for Ikari Warriors. And I have to say, to Micronix's credit, they did manage to include all of the things that the NES could technically handle from the arcade version. The controls are a disaster, obviously, but Ikari Warriors on NES does allow 2-person simultaneous play. You can attack with your standard weapon or toss grenades. You can hop into tanks and crush all who dare to cross your path. That's the good of it. The bad is, well, it's real bad. If you thought Alpha Mission and 1942 were repetitive slogs, my friend, you will not enjoy Ikari Warriors on NES. For some reason, Micronix decided that what this bad port of an arcade hit really needed was even more bad port, so they made the NES levels twice as long as in the original coin-op release. This is actually very funny because Ikari Warriors is incredibly difficult on NES, and the only way to continue is to use a hidden cheat code. The idea that kids would actually reach the game's ending without knowing the hidden code seems unlikely on its own, but the prospect of making it through twice as much of this jank without infinite continues is really giving NES fans a lot more credit than they deserve. No shade toward NES fans is intended here, it's just that this is a lot to survive. We're talking pro-grade speedrunner feats. Because Ikari Warriors plays horribly. It recaptures the sputtering movement and constant flicker of 1942 while also putting a lot more stuff on screen. Enemies that attack less predictably and from all directions. Meanwhile, the controls feel even worse than you might expect, not only forcing players to rotate their aim by actually moving in that direction while slowly turning their weapon, meaning you have to advance toward danger before you can shoot at it, but also causing everything to chug along like it's all playing in slow motion. It's really just a terrible experience. I have heard people defend Ikari Warriors by saying that the NES lacked two-player simultaneous shooters at the time, and that Ikari Warriors should be celebrated for bringing that option into our living rooms, no matter how poorly. This is not correct. Even at the time, everyone I knew and everyone I played it with hated it. There's no redeeming this game, honestly, short of handing it to another developer for a do-over. It's a disaster of a port. And finally, the worst game of the NES's first 2 years of life isn't even really a game. It's Stackup, the incomplete robot software that makes collectors' lives collectively worse. I mean, on one hand, you have to admire Nintendo's commitment to the bit. They knew that retailers who had been burned on the Atari era's flood of bad software didn't want to commit to carrying a video game system again. But a cool robot toy? Now that's something else. And so Nintendo gave us Rob, the robot operating buddy, who came packed in with deluxe console sets and could be used to control the interactive augmented reality puzzle game Gyromite. But it wouldn't do for Rob to work with only one game, so Nintendo also gave us Stackup, which sold separately in an oversized box loaded with more doodads for Rob to manipulate. Stackup looks like it should be a game, and it works almost like a programming exercise. But it fails to be either, giving players unimpressive goals, manipulating Rob to move colored rubber blocks into the patterns shown on screen, and no in-game means of measuring player success. All of this plays out through a sort of platform-hopping game, where a tiny scientist jumps around a grid of switches, avoiding creatures as he attempts to trigger buttons that relay commands to Rob. You can also use a linear command chain to program Rob to perform actions, but again, the game software can't actually determine the results of your actions, since they take place in the real world, and Rob's optical sensors only read the screen, not the other way around. Like Ikari Warriors, I don't know that there's a way to salvage Stackup. Not because it's so poorly programmed or unsuited to the hardware, but simply because there's just not much to work with here. A robot that reads screen flashes which trigger his movements. A set of simple rubber pucks that he can grip and drop, but with no way for those objects to interact with the game or provide some manner of feedback the way Gyromite's spinners do. What do you even do with that? Nintendo had no idea either, so don't feel bad when you can't come up with anything. And don't feel bad when you can't afford to drop a few $1,000 on a copy of Stackup for yourself. In our hearts, we all know that your NES collection is perfectly complete without it. Next time on NES Works, actually, I don't know. I guess we'll find out.